Detroit, early 1940s. A child was growing up on the streets, cold, hungry, in the middle of a life where nothing was guaranteed. That child's name was Jackie Wilson. Growing up in Detroit's black neighborhoods in those years meant reinventing survival every single morning. There were factories, but the factories didn't take everyone. There were schools, but the schools didn't give everyone the same thing. And the streets were where danger and freedom lived at the same time, often in the same moment, sometimes indistinguishable from each other. Jackie Wilson was a child of those streets. But this is not the story of how a child survived. This is the story of how that child turned survival into an art form. And that art form had a name: music. Years later, the man who mesmerized millions under stage lights was once a boy fighting just to see the next day in the dark corners of Detroit. And every heavy moment of that childhood, every difficult morning when there wasn't enough food or enough warmth or enough of anything, every desperate night when the future seemed like a door that had been locked from the outside, all of it lived on, years later, inside Jackie Wilson's voice. You could hear it if you listened closely enough, something underneath the notes that wasn't technique and couldn't be learned, something that only comes from having actually lived through something that required everything you had and then asked for more. That something was Detroit, and Detroit doesn't leave a person, it travels with them.
Jackie Wilson was born on June 9, 1934, in Detroit, Michigan. Detroit in those years was two cities at the same time. On one side stood the automobile factories: Ford, General Motors, Chrysler. These factories brought money to the city, made it grow, turned it into the industrial heart of America. But you didn't have to look far to understand that this money was not distributed equally, and that the distance between the people who benefited from the factories and the people who labored inside them was not just economic, but deliberate. Black families had come to Detroit from the South in what history calls the Great Migration, escaping violence, escaping laws designed to keep them in poverty, escaping a system built from the ground up to work against them. They found factory work in Detroit, but they found the heaviest, most dangerous, lowest paid work. Their neighborhoods were separate, their schools were separate, their lives ran on separate tracks through the same city. The wealth that Detroit generated passed around them, not through them, close enough to see, far enough to remain out of reach. Jackie Wilson grew up in the middle of that reality. His family was poor, concretely, not abstractly. He knew what it felt like when there was no money, when heat in winter was a luxury you planned around rather than assumed, when the table didn't always have enough on it and you learned not to say so. That kind of childhood either breaks a person or hardens them into something that cannot be broken. It hardened Jackie Wilson, but it did something else too. It gave him an intimacy with difficulty that most people never acquire, a knowledge of what it actually feels like to need something and not have it, that would later become the emotional core of everything he sang. But hardening doesn't happen instantly. First come the fragile years. Jackie's childhood had a particularly difficult stretch, the years when his father was absent, when his mother was carrying everything alone, when Jackie was both the oldest child in the house and someone who had to grow up faster than any child should. Those years left marks, not the kind you could see, the kind that settle somewhere deep and stay there permanently, shaping the way a person moves through the world long after the circumstances that created them have passed. The streets pulled at him the way they pull at every boy in those circumstances. The street offered community, belonging, a set of rules that were comprehensible even when they were brutal. Jackie was drawn to it, but what he found in the street wasn't only danger, he also found music. In Detroit's black neighborhoods, music was everywhere. Gospel poured out of churches on Sunday mornings with a force that you could feel in your chest from half a block away. Rhythm and blues came through the radio at all hours. On street corners, groups gathered and sang, listened to each other, competed in the friendly, serious way that people compete when they love something and want to be the best at it. Young Jackie Wilson stood among them and noticed something. His voice was different from the voices around him. Not just better, different in a specific way that he couldn't have named at that age, but that other people could feel when they heard it. Something in the sound that made people stop and turn toward it.
Boxing entered Jackie Wilson's life when he was around 12 years old. This wasn't a choice made from an abundance of options. For many young men in Detroit in those years, boxing was the least dangerous thing the street was offering. It gave you discipline. It gave you a place to be, a reason to show up somewhere every day with a purpose that belonged entirely to you. And it gave you an identity that you had built yourself through your own effort and pain that nobody could take away by simply deciding you weren't worth anything. Jackie Wilson walked through that door, and then he discovered he was genuinely good. Not street-tough good, technically, strategically good in a way that surprised people who didn't know him yet. Coaches noticed him early. Other fighters took him seriously. When Jackie Wilson entered Golden Gloves competitions, his opponents noticed him too, usually at a point in the fight when there wasn't much they could do about it. The ring taught Jackie things that would stay with him for the rest of his life and show up in places nobody would have predicted. He learned to read a space, to understand where he was in relation to everything around him and how that relationship was shifting from second to second. He learned to read another person's body, when they were open, when they were defensive, when the precise moment to move had arrived and would not wait. He learned that timing was a different thing than speed, and that a patient fighter often beats a faster one because patience is actually a form of intelligence applied to movement. And he learned to stay calm under pressure, to slow his own thinking when everything around him was accelerating, to find the still point inside the chaos and work from there. These lessons would prove just as valuable on stage as they were in the ring, more valuable in some ways because a stage never ends with a knockout.
Years later, Jackie Wilson's stage movement carried the unmistakable imprint of what boxing had pressed into his body. Every step deliberate, every position meaningful. The way he used space, moving toward the audience in a way that drew them in, pulling back in a way that made them lean forward trying to follow him, was the spatial intelligence of someone who had learned to treat space as a living, responsive thing rather than an empty backdrop. The audience felt the result without being able to identify where it came from. In the early 1950s, Jackie was running both tracks simultaneously, training by day and singing by night, or the reverse depending on what the schedule demanded. He didn't yet feel that he had to choose between them. He was good at both, he loved both, and in his mind at that point there was no reason the two couldn't continue together indefinitely. But the choice came. One night, Jackie came out of a boxing match with his face carrying the clear evidence of what had happened inside the ring. He had won, but the winning had been physical, and the cost was visible. That same night, he was supposed to perform at a club across town. He stood in front of a mirror in the locker room, looking at himself, and understood something that hadn't been obvious to him before that moment. The ring takes your face. The stage needs your face. You couldn't give fully to both at the same time, not really. The body that boxing required and the body that the stage required were pulling in different directions, and eventually those directions would pull far enough apart that choosing one meant giving up the other. Jackie Wilson chose music, and in doing so, he redirected everything the ring had given him, every lesson about space, timing, reading people, staying centered under pressure, toward a stage instead of a canvas. Nothing was lost. It was all just aimed differently.
Jackie Wilson's path into professional music wasn't a single dramatic crossing. It was a gradual movement from the informal to the serious,
from singing wherever anyone would let him to building something that had real weight and staying power. The opportunity that changed everything came in 1951. The Dominoes were one of the most important rhythm and blues groups of the era, and they needed a new lead singer. Clyde McPhatter had left, and replacing him was not a simple matter. McPhatter was one of the most celebrated voices in the genre. The expectation attached to the position was enormous, and the audition room reflected that. It was not a room that forgave ordinariness. Jackie Wilson auditioned. Many young men wanted the position. When Jackie stepped forward and sang, the people making the decision looked at each other within the first few bars. Something had shifted in the room. Not just the voice, what lived inside the voice, the capacity to carry joy and heartbreak simultaneously with equal conviction in a way that made listeners feel things they hadn't known they were holding. And the body, when Jackie Wilson stood in front of people, all of him was present. His face, his hands, his shoulders, the way he occupied the space around him. Everything moved with the music, as though the music and the person were a single thing that couldn't be pulled apart. He got the position, and the boy from Detroit's poorest streets stepped for the first time under real stage lights in front of a real audience with a real band behind him. What he felt that first night is something he never fully described in any interview or conversation that has survived. But anyone who has ever loved a stage knows the sensation. When the lights find you, when the audience's attention gathers on you, when the music begins and you begin, and for those minutes, everything settles into exactly the place it was always supposed to be. You understand somewhere in your body, before your mind catches up, that this is what you were built for. Jackie Wilson found that feeling on his first real stage, and he held on to it through everything that followed, through Brunswick Records and the financial exploitation, through the years when the music industry moved on to younger faces and newer sounds, through the physical accumulation of decades of giving everything every night. That feeling, the one that first arrived under those Detroit stage lights, stayed with him until the night in 1975 when the stage lights finally went out and didn't come back on.
Jackie Wilson's name reached the world in 1957 with Reet Petite. But behind that song, behind that voice, behind that stage presence that made Elvis go quiet and James Brown take notes, were years. Detroit years. Years that nobody in the music industry talked about. Years that didn't fit neatly into a promotional narrative. Years that were too hard and too specific and too real to package into anything clean. Detroit gave him poverty. Real, concrete, unromanticizable poverty that pressed itself into his voice and created a weight in its depths that couldn't be easily named and couldn't be missed. You don't acquire that quality through vocal training. You acquire it by having lived through something that demanded everything you had. Detroit gave him resistance, a refusal to be stopped that ran deeper than ambition, closer to identity, forged in circumstances that would have justified stopping 100 times over. Detroit gave him the boxer's discipline and the boxer's intelligence, the ability to read a room, to read a crowd, to find the precise moment and the precise movement and the precise silence that would do what needed to be done. And Detroit gave him the music itself, gospel, blues, rhythm and blues, all of it absorbed across childhood and early years, all of it released again every time he stood in front of a microphone. There is a particular kind of person who comes from circumstances like Jackie Wilson's and builds what he built. Most are stopped along the way. Jackie Wilson was not stopped. Not by poverty, not by the boxing ring, not by Brunswick Records, not by a music industry that took what it wanted and moved on. He was slowed, he was damaged, he was taken advantage of in ways that were serious and should be named clearly, but he was never stopped.
And the voice that came out the other side, the voice that made Elvis stop mid-conversation, that made James Brown take mental notes, that made audiences feel something they couldn't explain, was not a voice that arrived from nowhere. It was built across years out of everything Detroit gave him and everything Detroit cost him. It matters because of what it reveals about where greatness actually originates. When the music industry presented Jackie Wilson to the world in 1957, it presented a finished product. It didn't present the hunger, the boxing rings, the street corners, the mother carrying everything alone, the boy forced to grow up before anyone should have to. Those things didn't fit on a promotional poster. But that background wasn't separate from the music. It was the music. Every audience that ever felt something unusual when they heard Jackie Wilson, something that seemed to reach further into them than a voice had any right to, was feeling Detroit. They just didn't have a name for it. The weight in the voice, the thing beneath the notes, the knowledge communicated through sound alone that the person singing had been somewhere real and come back from it. Detroit. The cold mornings and the empty tables, and the streets that offered both danger and music in equal measure. The mother who held things together when they should have fallen apart. The boy who found in boxing and in music two different ways of saying the same thing. I am still here. I am not finished. Whatever you put in front of me, I will find a way through it. He found his way through everything, not without cost, not without damage, but through. Detroit made Jackie Wilson, and Jackie Wilson made something that outlasted everything that tried to unmake him. That is what real sounds like, and real, as it turns out, lasts a very long time. If Jackie Wilson's story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. This channel is dedicated entirely to Jackie Wilson, his triumphs, his losses, and everything that happened behind the curtain. Drop a comment below. Did you know the story of where Jackie Wilson came from?